Good morning. I hope everybody's doing really well. Today is lecture 14, The Age of the Enlightenment, Setting the Stage. As early as about 1730, even while Bach was composing at the height of the Baroque period, new undercurrents of thought were becoming manifest in art, music, philosophy, education, industry, finance, and religion. The focus was changing from absolute leadership and privilege of the high clergy and aristocracy to a rising and strengthening middle class. Before we talk about the changes that occur with the Enlightenment, let's look at the innovations that take place in the Baroque in this area of science that lead and enable these changes to take place. So the area that we're going to look at primarily is the area of agriculture. And this takes place first and foremost in Britain, but also in the rest of the continent. So the main innovations that take place through this scientific focus of the Baroque period are innovations in crop rotation. That is, letting one part of your crop, one part of your field lie fallow while the other ones produce crops, and letting the soil rest until the nutrients are back into the soil and the crops are then rotated. The plow was an innovation. Also an innovation were the idea of enclosures. Now enclosures were a couple of areas actually. One was the consolidation of small land holdings into larger farms. The land then was used by the owner and not simply public or communal use. In England and Wales, these areas of land were fenced in instead of open, so that's also enclosure. So by fencing it in, it protected the crops. By consolidating and being under one owner rather than many communal owners, it allowed the farmer to decide what was best to use in farming practices, such as crop rotation. There was land conversion, that is, taking grazing lands and converting to arable land. And of course, improved transportation, allowing crops to get to market. Additional benefits that were not scientific at all, but actually just happened, was a climate that was more supportive of agriculture. At the end of the 17th century, through the 17th century even, there were fewer plagues. And of course, there was improvements toward the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century in house building. So instead of the traditional wooden house with thatched roofs that had been used for hundreds of years, more and more we see that houses are being built with stone or brick. That keeps the rats away, keeps the fleas away, leads to better overall hygiene and health conditions, and much more sturdy. So the results from all of these innovations, plus the climate and other areas, at the risk of being a little bit simplistic actually, but at least we'll get an idea, the results include a higher rate of food production. That increases the population, or at least sustains the population growth. We see then an expansion of large cities. We see, with higher population, a growth in manufacturing and trade. This leads to a better economy, and the better economy leads to a growth of the wealthy or urban middle class. This wealth is also called the nouveau riche, the newly rich. That is wealth that has been accumulated through business or trade or something that has happened recently, rather than being wealth that has been passed down through the generations and through the nobility or through your family. So there, in the middle class then, there's a larger group of wealthy people, and they become more important socially. So here we have the stage set for the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries that challenged traditional thinking. The Enlightenment was a focus on both the rational and the individual. Okay, so rationalism and individualism. We call the Enlightenment also then the Age of Reason. The focus of the Enlightenment, the center of influence, takes place once again in France, and especially with the French philosophers. The philosophers concentrated on what they called philosophical humanism, or a rationalism. In other words, problems can be solved by thinking it out, by reasoning. And the problems that occur are societal problems. So therefore, the focus is on the individual and groups of individuals. This is a really new concept. Prior to this, it was sort of groupthink, where the focus was on the community, the focus was on the group, and what's best for the community is best for all. But now we see movement toward an individualism where all the people are important, and the way to create a better society is by focusing on individuals and pulling all the individuals up. And so we see, again, one of the first times in history, a focus on human rights. So they noticed, of course, the French philosophers and others, that there was a wide class difference, the common versus the privileged. We'd had prior to this, all through the Baroque period and prior, absolute monarchies, which we have talked about in terms of Louis XIV in France, or Henry the Third, Henry IV, going on in Charles, in the reigns of Mary in England. We see French kings, English kings, Spanish kings. We see families and princes in the Germanic areas and also in Italian-speaking areas. So we have this idea of absolute monarchies, and then the others, the bourgeoisie, which is this middle class. And in France particularly, it's the middle class that pay all the taxes to support both the aristocracy and the clergy. So the way that things are laid out in France is that France is comprised of 3 estates, E-S-T-A-T-E-S, 3 estates. The first estate is the clergy, the second estate, the nobility, and the third estate, everyone else. The clergy and the nobility pay no taxes and get lots of privileges. The everyone else pays the taxes. We'll focus on this a little bit more later. So the philosophers wanted to focus on that differentiation of wealth. They also wanted to focus on a humanitarianism. So in other words, the welfare of humankind, on social reform. They wanted to make a focus on integrity and honesty and love for all of humankind. The Freemasons, for example, were a group of people who had a belief in universal brotherhood. The most famous publication that comes out of the Enlightenment is a dictionary or an encyclopedia edited by Denis Diderot, who was alive from 1713 to 1784. He was a French philosopher, art critic, and writer. And the transcript of the title is this: Encyclopedia or Rational Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Professions, a collection of theoretical and practical knowledge. So let's talk about these French philosophers and who they are. Firstly, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, R-O-U-S-S-E-A-U, born in 1683 and lived until 1764. He was a philosopher, a writer, and a musician. He believed that man is born good but is corrupted by society. He said, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau believed in natural human rights. Voltaire was another famous French philosopher, born in 1694 and lived until 1778. Voltaire was a writer and a philosopher and a playwright. And as quoted in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he said, "Those equipped to understand their own reason can find the proper course of free action themselves. But since many are incapable of such self-knowledge and self-control, religion is a necessary guarantor of social order." Now, Voltaire was a reform-minded monarchist, not so much a proponent of democratic ideals. He saw, though, the power and the value of empirical science meaning science that can be observed and proven through observation and experience. Now, we talk about the French movement as being the principal movement, the center, the place where that's most influential. But the Enlightenment we see also in other areas. For example, philosophers come out of England, such as John Locke, born 1634, lived till 1704. John Locke wrote an essay. He actually wrote many essays. One of them saying, titled "An Essay Concerning Human Understanding." He explored how humans perceive thought and then express themselves through language and logic. John Locke believed that power should be with the people. In Germany, we have Immanuel Kant. It's K-A-N-T. And he was born in 1724 and lived until 1804. And he wrote an essay in 1784 where he said that the Enlightenment was emancipation from self-incurred tutelage. The motto should be dare to know. And if you think about it, knowledge as liberation. So the Enlightenment focus becomes then on education, on social reform, and on the arts and literature. So let's think about this kind of in a big, broad scope. The Middle Ages, right? In the Middle Ages, we have the church as being first and foremost. The church solved the problems. The church was the place that people looked toward to know how to live, to find salvation in the afterlife. The church had a powerful hold on people. When we get to the Renaissance, that is after that crazy 14th century. In the Renaissance, it's less about the church and more about looking back toward antiquity to find the ideals and the ideal way of living. In antiquity, we're talking about ancient Greek and Roman ideals. That changes over the course of the Renaissance with scientific innovation and exploration and the trade routes to, as I said, in the Baroque period, where the emphasis was on science. Right, and the man's place in the world, humankind's place in the world, understanding the world around people. And now as we go into the next period, which will become the classical period, we see the emphasis turning now instead of on man's place in the world, on mankind itself or humankind itself. So, as I said, focus on education and the pursuit of learning. Focus on social reform, and focus on literature, on philosophy, on arts, on the sciences, where all of the above were appealing to a general audience. In other words, education shouldn't be for one group of people alone, but rather should be for everyone. And during this period, we're going to see lots and lots of treatises. In other words, lots of explanation books, how-to books, even in history books that are written for people to read and understand and sort of self-educate. Okay, so there's basically the idea of culture for all.
Along with the focus on written culture and education, the public also had a love of art. The Rococo style was a reaction against the grandeur of the Baroque style, and so we can see that art is also in transition. The Rococo style was popular between 1700 and 1770 and originally meant a shell design. It was a French movement but had similarities in England. There was a focus on small, ornate, graceful lines. It was meant to be enjoyed by all. It was elegant, simple, and light. So in other words, it maintained the ornateness of the Baroque but was much, much lighter. Here we can see in the 1717 painting the lightness, the swirls, the graceful lines of the trees, of the clouds, of the elegance of the clothing of each of the characters in the painting. Everything is very light. It's busy, but it's still light. It's elegant. There's no heavy drama that we saw in the Baroque, like in the Baroque paintings, but rather a lightness, an elegance, a simplicity almost. This is one of my favorite paintings from 1767. It's a little bit toward the end of the Rococo style. Everything is so delicate looking and graceful. You can imagine the shell design that Rococo originally meant. And finally, the same in the 1750, the love letter. We can also see the elegance, the grace, the small details, the simpleness, the lightness. You can see also that each of these paintings would be very accessible by the general audience. They would understand the painting. There's not much to really dive into and think about, but rather what you see is what you get. Other than love of art, the public also had a love of music, which also was in transition as well. We're going to look at Domenico Scarlatti's music right now. Scarlatti was born the same year as Bach and Handel in 1685 and lived until 1757. But Scarlatti took a very different approach. He was born in Naples. He was the son of a famous vocal composer, Alessandro Scarlatti. By age 16, he was the musician at the Royal Chapel, and 2 years later, at age 18, he and his father left Naples and went to Rome. Domenico was then able to study with the great musicians of Italy. He even worked for the exiled Polish queen while he was in Rome. He gained fame as a harpsichordist. He spent 5 years, from 1714 to 1719, as the director of music, or the Maestro di Cappella, at the Julian Chapel at St. Peter's Basilica. He not only was a harpsichordist, but he was a composer, particularly of keyboard sonatas, of which he wrote 555 over the course of his lifetime. In 1720, he left Rome and traveled first to London and then to Lisbon, where he became the harpsichordist at the royal court. At the same time, he was the teacher of the royal princesses. In 1725, his father died and he returned to Italy. But 3 years later, Scarlatti was invited to the Spanish court by one of the princesses who had married Ferdinand VI. Scarlatti took her up on the offer and went first to Sevilla from 1729 to 1733, and then to Madrid, where he lived until his death in 1757. His music has influences of Spanish folk and dance music, which you'll hear in the piece we'll now look at. But before we look at it, I'd like you to pause the video and play the Scarlatti piece that's linked below. This is an interesting piece. It's for harpsichord, and as you're listening, I want you to think about the characteristics that it has in common with Baroque and those that are different. So pause the video and play the Scarlatti piece below. The Sonata in C major, K159, La Caccia, The Hunt, was composed in 1738 while Scarlatti was at the Spanish court. So, what does it have in common with Baroque? Well, first of all, it's played by harpsichord. There is a continuous rhythm, so continuous sound. The texture is quite full, despite the fact that it looks simple. Probably that texture is full because, again, there are no holes in the rhythm, right? I mean, it just continues. It's in 2 parts, so like the suites, it's in a binary form. A is repeated, and then B is repeated. And there's really where the differences end. If you listen to it, you can understand that it's accessible to all audiences. It's an easy piece to listen to. It's light, it's fun. There's not a lot of depth. If you think about comparing it to Bach, there's not a lot of inner parts that's complex, or there isn't a lot of heaviness in the texture, but rather it's a light piece emphasizing the 6/8 meter. There's an emphasis on the melody. You can tell that this is very vocally conceived. In other words, the melody is singable, and if you look at it, it's in smaller or shorter balanced phrases. For example, take a look at the first phrase. We see that the phrase basically repeats, bum 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 ba-da-dum, and it repeats now, bum 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 ba-da-dum, and then it does the same thing in the next phrase, bum bum ba-da-dum, bum ba-da-dum, repeats, bum bum ba-da bum ba-da bum ba-da bum. You know, so you can see that the way that it's organized is in small, short, balanced mini phrases, so to speak. The texture is, while full, also thinner, and it is very natural sounding. So there's simplicity, there's elegance, there's lightness, there's grace. There are some ornaments which also bridge that gap between the Baroque and the classical, but these ornaments are much more in line with the Rococo style of painting. They're small ornaments, they're elegant ornaments, they're graceful ornaments. Let's take a look now at the form. So as I said before, we are in binary form, that is a two-part form. The A section, which goes to the top of the second page, and then the B section, which continues afterward until the end. What we saw with the Bach examples and the cello suite was that it began in 1 and ended in 5, and then for the most part started in 5 and ended in 1. Here's another difference that we see. Notice that we're in C major, and we do begin in the tonic, of course, and transition to the dominant. We do end the first section, the A section, in the dominant. There's no doubt that we end in the dominant. But look what happens at the beginning of the B section. We are moving away from the start of 5 and moving toward what we might call X, or a modulatory section. It looks like we start in the minor 1 in C minor, but then it continues to shift. Notice especially as we get toward measure 35, 36, 37, it is shifting, and we have what sounds much more modulatory. However, by measure 43, we are back in the dominant, which sets up the return to C major and also a return to the opening melody. That continues until the end of the piece, at which point we repeat the B section. This style of music that is transitional from the heaviness of the Baroque, just like the art, is called galant, the galant style, G-A-L-A-N-T. Here's where we're going to end, and we'll pick it up with more music next time. Have a great day.